rope. We're tying our mind with a rope of mindfulness to the object. And then the hook of introspection is monitoring that mindfulness, is quality control. Noticing if we're becoming dull or distracted, and if we are, to hook the mind back and reapply mindfulness to the object. So let's now have a look at the last point here, faults, and for that we'll use the handouts. If you go to page 2, up the top there's a sentence which says, Shamatha is attained by progressing through the 9 stages, and the 9 stages are the stages along this windy road, which we'll start to look at a little bit later in the retreat, towards the end of the retreat. Relying on the 8 antidotes to abandon the 5 faults. So here we see a little table of the 5 faults and 8 antidotes. So let's have a look at these 5 faults, what they are, and how to overcome them with these antidotes. So the first fault here mentioned is laziness. And so like everything in our life, if we see no benefit in something, we're going to become very lazy when it comes to doing that thing. So similarly here, if we don't really appreciate the benefits of this practice, we're going to be very lazy in doing this practice. We're not going to even want to do the practice. So therefore, we have actually 4 antidotes to laziness. The first of those is faith. So faith here is having to reflect on the benefits, to understand that this practice is going to bring us a lot of benefits, and then we'll develop faith in the practice. Here faith means we have faith that this practice is going to bring us a lot of benefit. So what are the benefits of this practice? We saw briefly yesterday evening that at a sort of very immediate level, everyday life level, if we work on this shamatha practice and cultivate a more calm, clear, focused mind, then of course we're going to be much more effective in everything we do in our life. Again, the mind is going to be much more calm, less agitation and stress, much less mental imbalance. In fact, there is a quote from a great Indian Buddhist master, Shantideva, in the 8th century, and he says, "Those with a distracted mind are trapped in the jaws of the mental afflictions." Meaning, if our mind is distracted, it's much easier for us to get caught up in craving, attachment, jealousy, anger, frustration, irritation, and so forth. And so what you will find is that if we put effort into this practice and have a more calm, clear, focused mind, you'll find that it's more difficult for these mental afflictions like craving, attachment, jealousy, anger, and frustration, and so forth to arise. So we'll have much better mental imbalance, much less mental imbalance. And also, what we're going to see, particularly when we look at the practice of focusing on the mind, this shamatha practice will really help us to become the masters of our own mind. Now, many of us in the modern world are the slaves of our own mind. We're often tormented and overwhelmed by our thoughts, emotions, memories, and so forth. And of course, we don't know how to deal with these, particularly if they're unpleasant. So we end up fighting with the mind, trying to suppress these negative emotions and thoughts and memories. And of course, that just makes it worse. And we often, therefore, are the slaves of our mind. Many of us have made our mind our worst enemy. This practice of observing the mind in particular, and shamatha practice in general, will really help us to become the masters of our own mind, not the slaves of our own mind. And also, now what we tend to do a lot is if something unpleasant comes up and we don't know how to deal with it, we just try and suppress it. And of course, doing that is not dealing with it. And often that suppressing of those negative thoughts, emotions, memories, and so forth simply ends up in them manifesting as a lot of physical problems in the body. And then often we project a lot of that negativity onto the people around us. And so by doing this practice of observing the mind, we'll stop that suppression, which means that this starts the healing process. So this is very much also heals the mind. And then, of course, as we've seen in the Buddhist context, at a much deeper level, if we engage in this shamatha practice, cultivating a calm, clear, focused mind, then that's going to be the basis for the wisdom of vipassana practice. So you'll find that your vipassana practice will work much better, it'll be much more effective. Similarly, the loving kindness, compassion practice, in fact, all practices will be much more effective the more calm, clear, focused mind we have. So if we reflect on these sorts of benefits of this practice, we're going to start to have the first antidote, faith. Faith that this practice is really going to benefit us. The more faith we have in the practice, the more we'll have the second antidote. The more we'll aspire to do the practice. The more we'll want to do the practice. And then the more we aspire to do the practice, the more effort we'll put into the practice, which is the third antidote, here translated as enthusiasm. So enthusiasm really just means enthusiastically putting effort into the practice. And then the more effort we put into the practice, the more we'll have the fourth antidote of pliancy. Pliancy here means flexibility or serviceability of body and mind. And I'll talk more about this later in the retreat. But very briefly now, both our body and mind are not very pliant or serviceable. We tend to have a lot of aches and pains in the body, and we have a lot of resistance in our mind to the practice. But the more we get into the practice, the more you'll find less problems in the body, and the more you'll find less resistance in the mind. The more flexible and serviceable both body and mind will become. And so that's pliancy, but again, we'll speak more about that later in the retreat. So that's the first fault of laziness, and these are the four antidotes. The second fault here is forgetfulness. So this can mean either forgetting the instructions or forgetting the object. So, of course, the antidote to that is mindfulness, is to remember the instructions, to remember the object, to hold the object. And then the third fault here is the pair of laxity and excitation. So laxity is the technical word here for dullness, drowsiness. And excitation is the most common form of distraction. Because generally we are distracted by something exciting, something interesting. Generally the so-called sense pleasures draw our attention away. And we can see that in this diagram here. If we look part way up on the left, we see a bowl of fruit. So that's taste. Beside that we see a silk cloth. So that's touch or tactile. Above that we have two round objects which are symbols. So that's sound. To the left of that we have a conch shell with some perfume in it. So that's smell. And then diagonally above that we have a round object which is a mirror. So that's visual. So these are the five sense objects which are the most common form of distraction. So therefore, instead of distraction here, we often see this word excitement or excitation. So these are the two faults of dullness and distraction. And here, of course, the antidote is introspection. So introspection is to monitor for dullness and distraction. Monitor the mindfulness, noticing if we're becoming dull or distracted, and if we find ourselves becoming dull or distracted, then just simply reapply mindfulness to the object, to hold the object again. Now, there's a couple of key words that can help us to remind us as beginners what to do if we're dull or distracted. So remember, we said that often when we get distracted, we tend to get frustrated and then we tense automatically. So to avoid that, the very first thing to do when we notice we've become distracted is simply relax the body and mind. And then to simply release the distraction and then very gently return to the breath, to the object. Without clamping down harder. So again, relax, release, return. Simply keep coming back to the object again and again and again. Of course, at the moment we're working with the breath. So this is a couple of key words that can help us, particularly as a beginner, to know what to do when we're distracted. But also for when we notice we're becoming dull or drowsy, there's a couple of key words that can help remind us what to do as well. One of the most common reasons that we become dull or drowsy is that we've simply lost interest in the practice. So if you're noticing you're becoming very, very dull and drowsy because you're not really interested in the practice anymore, then a good thing to do is to refresh your interest in the practice. Maybe even reflecting on very briefly a couple of these benefits and understanding this practice is really going to benefit us. And then, of course, to restore our attention on the object. Meaning if we've become very dull and drowsy, we've lost the object. So just restore our attention, meaning reapply mindfulness. And then, of course, once we've reapplied mindfulness, is to maintain that mindfulness. So retain the mindfulness, retain the flow of mindfulness. So not simply reapply mindfulness and then go dull again, but retain that flow of mindfulness of the object. And particularly here with the breath, to really maintain the mindfulness of the sensations of breath throughout the entire cycle of each in and out breath. So this is what we can do. These keywords can help us as a beginner to know what to do. But of course, once we get into the practice, we won't need to sort of think about these points because they'll just become automatic. But as a beginner, if we're not really sure what to do, then these key words can help us keep on track and know what to do in the event of any dullness or distraction. So that's what's being talked about here. So that is the third fault of laxity and excitation. Again, dullness and distraction, and how to apply the antidote to that through introspection. The fourth fault here is non-application. So non-application means that we've noticed there's a problem, so we've noticed we've become dull or distracted, but we don't do anything about that. That's a problem, that's a fault. So the antidote to that is application. So generally, if we've noticed we've become dull or distraction, application would be to simply reapply mindfulness. But again, it could be that if we've become dull or distracted because we've completely lost interest in the practice, application may first be think about the benefits for a little while to get enthusiastic and then reapply mindfulness. But generally here, it would simply, if we've noticed we've become dull or distracted, simply reapply mindfulness. That's application. There's a fifth fault here that actually as a beginner is not really a big problem, It's called over-application, but it can start to become a problem when we get into the higher levels of the practice. Over-application means that we're actually focusing quite well on the object and we are unnecessarily adjusting our focus. So that's a fault. And the antidote here is equanimity. And here the word equanimity means balance. It means our mind is already balanced, so just leave it as it is. Meaning, if it's not broken, don't fix it. So that's over-application. But for us as a beginner, that's not really a big issue because generally we need to keep fixing our attention pretty often because we're very quickly going into dullness and distraction. But as our attention skills improve and we're better and better on the object, then to unnecessarily adjust starts to become a problem. So that's a little bit higher in the practice. So these are the 5 faults and these are the 8 antidotes. And by applying these 8 antidotes to the 5 faults, as it said, we'll slowly move along these 9 stages to Shamatha, and we'll start to look at these 9 stages towards the end of the retreat, after we've done a lot more Shamatha practice. Okay, so that's the 4th one, the faults. So what I'd like to do now is go a little bit more into this breath practice we're currently doing on the abdomen, a little bit more comments, and then we'll go back into the practice. So again, just to read a few things from Attention Revolution. So again, on page 33, he says the following. We began this practice at stage 1, that's the beginning stage, with a primary emphasis on relaxation. Generally, the more relaxed we are, the more stable our attention can become. But that relaxation must be balanced with vigilance. Otherwise, it will simply lead to laxity, sluggishness, or unbridled daydreaming. Once we have established a foundation of relaxation, we can more strongly emphasize attentional stability. So again, the first emphasis in this practice is just working with relaxation. Once we have a more relaxed body and mind, then we can shift to emphasizing stability, as we're doing now. One way to cultivate attentional stability is to direct our attention downward to the sensations in the abdomen associated with the in and out breath. Mindfulness of the entire body, or also the rhythm of the breath, is very helpful for relaxing the mind, but this technique of focusing on the abdomen, which is commonly taught in the Burmese Theravada tradition, can be especially helpful for stabilizing the mind. Many Buddhist traditions, including Zen and Theravada Buddhism, encourage the practice of counting breaths as a means of stabilizing attention. And this advice is found in the Indian Mahayana tradition as well. The Theravada Buddhist tradition is based on the teachings attributed to the Buddha as first recorded in the Pali language and is focused on the attainment of one's own individual liberation or nirvana. And we'll start to talk about this topic of Theravada Mahayana. That'll be one of our evening topics, I think, tomorrow or the next day. So the Theravada Buddhist traditions are the ones that were transmitted through the Pali language. And then he says the Mahayana tradition is based on the teachings attributed to the Buddha as recorded in Sanskrit, and it centers on the realization of Buddhahood for the sake of all beings. And again, we'll talk more about that later. He says, one Mahayana sutra, for instance, states, so he's quoting a sutra teaching from the Buddha, he says, how do you correctly note with the power of mindfulness the in and out movement of the breath? You count them correctly. So now there, as I mentioned, there are many ways of counting, and we've briefly touched on 2. One is to count at the end of the out-breath, another one is to count at the end of the in-breath. But also we can do more or less counting. In fact, he's quoting again from this great 5th century master Asanga from one of his texts, and Asanga says, When the inhalation has come in, count 1 with mindfulness applied to inhalation, exhalation. When the exhalation has ceased and the exhalation has gone out, count 2, counting thus up to 10. The number of counting must not be too little or too much. This is called counting individually. So what he's suggesting is another option is to count 1 on the in-breath, 2 on the out-breath, 3 on the in-breath, 4 on the out-breath. So if you're really very, very much distracted, you may find a little bit more counting is more helpful, but you may also find less counting is enough. So like we did, we counted 1 on each in and out breath, but you can also do even less. You can do like 2 or 3 breaths and make that 1. So you can do more or less depending on what's going on. And also you can do what's called noting. Some traditions, instead of counting, talk about noting the breath. So instead of counting, you would do something like on the in-breath, you would mentally note breathing in or simply in, and then when you're breathing out, to mentally note breathing out or out. So in, out, or breathing in, breathing out. So noting is also used in some traditions. So what we're going to do in this practice is that you can optionally do any of these counting methods or noting if you find them helpful. So remember, counting or noting is not part of the actual practice. So it's only a sort of temporary, short-term strategy that you may find helpful in the initial phases to avoid heavy distraction. So again, in this next session, if you find that you're distracted a lot and you find counting or noting helpful, bring it in, one of these variations, whichever you prefer. If you don't find counting or noting helpful, you leave it out. At some point though, even if you're using counting or noting, when you get deeper into the practice, you'll need to let it go, because at some point it will start to simply become another distraction. So again, it's just a short-term strategy that you may find helpful. And so again, in this practice, next practice, if you're getting distracted a lot and you find it helpful, bring it in. Once you're more stable, then you can let go of that counting and just simply going back to focus on the sensations. One more point and then we'll go to the practice. He says, you might be surprised to see how much discomfort arises in your body, even when your practice sessions are relatively short and your meditation cushion is comfortable. This is normal, so don't become discouraged. You may view involuntary thoughts and bodily tension as informative signs of underlying mental and physical imbalances and learn from them. The unrest you experience in your body and mind is not the real problem. It is symptomatic of the extent to which your whole psychosomatic system is out of tune. Let these symptoms remind you to relax the mind and breathe into areas of tension in the body. So again, this is going back to this idea of pliancy, that you'll find that, of course, initially we have a lot of resistance in the mind, a lot of distractions in the mind, but also maybe a lot of aches and pains in the body. So as we go into this practice more and more, and we start to balance the mind, you'll find that you'll get less resistance from the mind, less distractions, but also at the physical level, you'll find that the body will cause less and less problems. And we'll talk more about that later. Okay. So let's do the practice again. So again, we're going to do the focusing on the abdomen. And then if you want to bring in counting or noting, you can do. If not, if it's not helpful, you don't need to bring it in. setting the body into a state of relaxation, stillness, and vigilance. Allowing the breathing to settle into its natural rhythm. And setting the mind in a state of ease and relaxation. Simply allowing it to come to rest in the present moment. And simply become aware of the rhythm of your breath.